So this is going to be an example of drawing a ballerina, because we do have quite a few people who were interested in Edgar Degas and his many ballerina paintings from the Impressionist time period. So right now I pulled up an image that I found online that is similar to some of the ones that some of you were looking at. And I just want to give you a quick demo of how to necessarily draw that ballerina. One thing to remember when you are drawing, especially when you're drawing people, is to make sure that you start sort of with like a skeletal framework. So you just want to draw sort of lines and shapes that sort of dictate where you're going to end up drawing the rest of the piece. So if I'm going to start on this ballerina, I might start with a little bit of her head here, just kind of as an oval. And then what I'm going to do is draw a line that shows where her back goes, a line that shows where her arm is, and then a line that shows where her leg goes, and then her other leg comes down here. So it might start very weird looking, of course, because it's just going to be sort of like a series of lines that looks quite funny and does not look like a ballerina at all yet. But what you will see is that as we add more detail and more layers and things like that to this drawing, that's when it's going to start looking like a ballerina. So I'm going to just kind of start with her arm here. Once again, still keeping it relatively simple at the beginning. And you can see she's leaning forward on this part of her. Her head is tilted back, her chest is leaning forward, and then her hips come pretty stacked straight up and down right here. Because then that other leg is somewhere around in here to where her thigh leans forward a little bit. And then goes down into her pointed toe. And then the other leg is elevated and turned out. And we don't see a whole lot of detail there. So I'm just going to kind of start with that. So now you can see it already looks a little bit more like a person. Definitely still got a good ways to go. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and add another layer. Just adding a little more detail to things. Because remember, with Impressionism, it's not like you're too worried about everything being 100% perfect. The main thing with Impressionism is to kind of capture the gist of the movement there. So it's okay if your rendition is not 100% accurate. And now I'm going to also start to look at her clothing a little bit, because that will help. So her skirt is long. So I'm just going to kind of start to draw in some of the lines and the shapes and angles for that. Again, I'm going to kind of draw a curve here because her skirt does mostly follow sort of a generic curve. Now these lines are going to show me sort of where the folds of the fabric are for when I get to the painting steps. So now I can erase where I had her legs behind the skirt, because we can't see the legs, we just see sort of the angle and shape of the skirt there. So I want to make sure that that's what stands out more. So now I'm just going to add a little more detail to that skirt. So you get a little more of those wrinkles and that movement in there. Because remember, once again, Impressionism is all about the movement. Post-Impressionism, it's a little more still and a little more steady. But with Impressionism, you really want to focus on capturing that movement. So just adding a little more detail to the skirt before I continue along here. And then I'm going to go back up here to where her foot is. Because her foot is at a funny angle because of how she has it turned. So I do want to make sure I kind of capture that. And then down here, her shin comes kind of forward a little bit. Her calf comes out behind it. And then her heel comes out. And then down to a point. And then the front of her foot comes out a little bit. And then down to that point. So you can see that my original lines were not necessarily exactly where they needed to be. So I changed them. That's one of the key things to remember when you are drawing anything. Is remember it's okay to make changes. In fact, it's good to make changes when they make your work more accurate. Now I'm going to go back up here into her arm again. Make sure I've got that a little more accurate as well. Because I can see the strap here. And then her arm is actually a little bit further back. And her shoulder kind of comes here. And then her elbow is about even with her head. So it's going to be a little bit wider there. And a slightly different angle. But then her wrist comes up here. And her thumb comes in front. And then kind of the rest of her hand is here. So it's once again okay if there's not 100% detail in like every single finger or anything like that. As long as you get the idea that it is an arm and it kind of makes sense, you can work with that. Then I'm going to add in her other arm that we see kind of just going back. We don't see much of it because it does go just kind of behind her there. But you can see that her shoulder is here and then the arm continues back. Now I'm going to work back into her face a little bit. Not going to worry too much about all the detail around her face. What I'm going to focus primarily on is the shape and the angle. So here's kind of where her chin is. And then this line kind of shows the angle of her face. And then we've got her hair here. And she has something in her hair. But we don't see her hair on the other side of her head. So I'm not going to worry about drawing that. We're going to fix her chin a little bit. I think it's too high up. And now, even though there's not necessarily a face on here, with Impressionism, that's okay. We don't necessarily need her whole face. Especially with your reproductions, I don't want you to get completely caught up on capturing a face completely exactly. I'm more concerned about the overall drawing. So the next thing I would do would be to erase any sort of things that I have changed, and then we'll do one more kind of glance through the entire thing to make sure that I've got all the details where they belong, make sure that things are a good size. And then when I am ready to start painting this one, which is pretty close to that stage, I would start with the background. So the background on this one is dark in the middle and gets lighter as we move out. And then there's a shadow here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and draw that shadow. And it just kind of goes off the page here. That way I know that this part is the darkest part of everything, but then this part is darker than the rest of it. Just simply because if you look at the image here on the computer screen, you can see where the darker and lighter values are and where that shadow is, and that is what you want to pay attention to when you get to the painting stage.